This is likely not gonna be a very popular video, but I will make an honest attempt to be as civil about the things I'm going to say as possible. I think it's important that it's established that what I'm about to say isn't a personal attack on anyone. My criticisms of these films isn't meant to be taken as, I think you're dumb for liking this, because that in itself would be a stupid as hell statement. Also, this should go without saying, but this video is just my personal opinion, and I'm not saying that you can't disagree with me, nor am I saying that you can't enjoy these films. I know it sounds stupid to throw out a disclaimer like that when by all means that should be the most obvious fucking thing ever, but believe me, I've seen enough stupid people on the internet to know that if you don't literally say that your opinions are your own opinions, then they will lose their fucking minds over it. This video was mostly brought about by the response I got to not liking Thor Ragnarok, where I got such comments as, if you don't like this movie, it means that you don't like good movies, or you have no sense of humor and your taste in movies sucks, or Thor Ragnarok has the best CGI in the industry and you're an idiot for not seeing that. Setting aside the fact that these are some of the most retarded things any human being has ever said to me, both because the CGI part is just verifiably incorrect and I can point to 1,000 movies, several of which are in the MCU itself, that prove that claim wrong.
Doyle, back to the Ranger now.
We're not leaving without her data.
Get back here now. We do not have time. The second wave is coming. We're in the middle of a swell. We have to go now. Wait. Come on! Come on! Please tell me you got that chopper in the air!
Sam, where are you?
41st floor, northwest corner!
Look at this dude. Wait till you see the. No, 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 no. Look at the top of his head. Look at his lips.
Okay. But also because this asinine idea that because I don't like something makes me a contrarian just for the sake of being a contrarian, or that because I didn't like a movie I apparently don't like good movies, or that I'm saying that because I don't like it that you can't like it, is frankly just a cancerous and idiotic mindset to have. I've never understood why people jerk off over the MCU as if it's the greatest thing ever made. I've made an actual attempt time and time again to go truly analyze these movies and figure out what exactly makes them so likable, and I can say that for the most part, I don't think the majority of these movies are bad. If anything, I think the majority of them are alright. They're nothing to be fawned over and praised like they're some cinematic masterpieces, but they're at the very least mostly fun. except for the Thor movies. And on top of that, for a while now, I've kind of wanted to make a video about this because it's always baffled me how immeasurably defensive Marvel fans will get if you don't like their movies. Not even just criticisms of the movies, mind you, just like the mere idea that someone doesn't like them from a personal standpoint. Like, not attacking the movies, not attacking the fans, just saying, I'm not a big fan of these movies, will make Marvel fans go apeshit like they're some ultra-religious movie sect of Antifa. Now, I like to think I'm usually pretty fair when I rate movies, even ones I don't like. For example, a lot of people liked Arrival. I really didn't like that movie at all for a variety of reasons. Mostly narrative reasons that I've been meaning to make a video about for like a whole year now, but have been procrastinating about actually making. I didn't enjoy it for reasons, again, I'll explain in another video entirely, but I do understand why people liked it. Inversely, I understand why people didn't like The Grey, since it was marketed like more of an action movie when it's really more centered on symbolism, but doesn't go out of its way to tell you that, which led people to thinking it was just fear-mongering against wolves and had a shitty ending. However, I really loved that movie, and at some point in this constant stream of procrastination, I will make a video on that too. Unless it comes to someone unironically liking a genuinely shit movie like Birdemic, which I'm fairly sure no one unironically likes, I don't ever really go out of my way to attack people for liking it. I disagree with their reasoning and argue against that, but if you like something I don't like, then more power to you. But I'm also not a pussy, and whether my opinions are positive or negative, I'll talk about them and force you to listen while subtly trying to convert you all into degenerate fur fags. So before you type that comment that I know you're already typing just by looking at the title of this video alone, let me start off by making a disclaimer that I shouldn't have to make, but no, I do have to make because people have a bit of an issue with listening. First off, when I say I don't like Marvel movies, I'm talking specifically about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so the X-Men films aren't a part of this video. Second, most of what I'm talking about doesn't pertain to Iron Man, Winter Soldier, or Doctor Strange because I actually really did like those movies and think that they're the few exceptions to what I'm going to be talking about here. Third, I don't honestly give a shit about the whole Marvel vs. DC thing. My last video took a giant steaming shit on Justice League, and I'm planning on making a video in the future breaking down why the DCEU is so god-awful. Needless to say, your comments about why I'm a DC fanboy or why I don't like good movies are just patently incorrect. Now that we got that shit out of the way, let's do this. Hearing a dissenting opinion of any given Marvel movie is enough to get you crucified on the internet. A Marvel movie comes out, reviewers love it, audiences love it, and by that logic, that must mean that if you don't love it, then you're just making a dissenting video because you seek attention. It couldn't possibly be that you just didn't like the movie. Now, when I come up with a verdict for a movie, I take several elements into account. I think the only way you can possibly make a fair review for a film, video game, music album, book, or anything in general is if you take every single aspect of that piece into account. Since the movies are what matter here, let me break this down. The key elements that I grade are story and writing, cinematography, special effects and CGI, acting, music, and editing. These are the 6 elements that make a good movie. This is generally how I look at all movies. I put an emphasis on story and writing because I think it's one of the most important parts. If your story sucks or is totally non-existent or inconsistent, then I'm gonna find it pretty difficult to give a shit about what's going on. This isn't to say that poorly written stories still can't be fun though. Battle Los Angeles falls apart into a million fucking pieces the instant you apply any level of scrutiny to it, but it does so well in the other areas I listed that I can still find it entertaining. And admittedly, a part of it comes down to personal preference. Sometimes, despite having a shitload of criticisms of something, I still like it. Balto falls apart in almost every single category I listed outside of music, but there's something weirdly endearing about it. Maybe it's just that the things it does good, it does so good that it makes me want to come back just to see those good things. Maybe it's just part of my own personal taste in the film. I think everyone has at least one movie they like, but they don't really know exactly why, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. We all have our guilty pleasures, so to say. A lot of what I'll be talking about in this video comes down to my own personal preferences. I recognize this is a divisive subject in and of itself. No one has the same exact preferences as someone else. So even if I think a movie does at least fairly well in all 6 elements listed before, I still might not totally like it because of the things I like or rather don't like. Again, it's okay to have personal preferences or guilty pleasures. The problem is when guilty pleasures extend to an entire series of incredibly mediocre films that are looked at as some high standard for movie making, which, although people really don't want to admit it, is a big reason why the MCU is popular in the first place. It's basically the world's biggest guilty pleasure. Let me explain. Now, this section of the video may or not be something you actually care about. I'm going to break down my experience with most of the MCU films in chronological order. These won't be full reviews, just brief snippets of what I generally thought of them. If I gave full reviews on every Marvel movie, we'd literally be here forever. But if you don't care about this and just want to get to the part where I actually break down the various reasons why I'm not a fan of these movies directly, then you can skip to the time on screen now. So I had never once seen a single Marvel film until about 4 or so years ago when I first saw Thor in my mythology class, where we compared and contrasted how the movie, well, basically bastardized Norse mythology. This was my very first introduction to the Marvel Universe, and I couldn't have been less impressed. Now granted, this is a Thor movie, and by now I've seen every Marvel movie aside from Spider-Man Homecoming, which I've heard extremely conflicting reviews for. I've heard it's a really good film from some people and really bad from others. Since I haven't seen it, we'll ignore it for this video. But as it turns out, Thor wasn't really all that much different from a technical perspective from any of the Marvel films. It's just that it's way fucking dumber than all of the other Marvel films. Around this same time, Thor: The Dark World came out and my friends wanted to go see it, so I went along with them. Somehow, this movie was much worse than the first Thor movie. I think its tone was more consistent, but it was still pretty fucking dumb. Every now and again, I dropped by the theater to see another Marvel movie. I saw Guardians of the Galaxy, Doctor Strange, and Captain America: Civil War. All of these films opened to undying praise, but Doctor Strange was the only one of the three that I actually liked. I thought Guardians of the Galaxy was a generally good-looking film and had some good jokes, a solid soundtrack, and mostly good acting, but the story was about as generic as it gets. The bad guy was bad because, well, he's bad. He wants to blow up the good guy homeworld because they're good. The aliens were startlingly unimaginative, with their best example being a tree person and a talking raccoon, everyone else being a human with weird skin colors. Civil War is a clusterfuck of ideas that sound great on paper, but it didn't really add up when put under scrutiny. The color grading was really dull, the action was boring, and the characters were really unimpressive. Now let's fast forward to this year. After watching Civil War, I had no idea why people liked these movies as much as they did, but admittedly, at that point, all I'd seen were the first 2 Thor movies, Doctor Strange, Guardians of the Galaxy, and the 3rd Captain America film. I was missing more than half of the franchise at that point. Surely if I actually watched all of them one by one, went in with an open mind, and really tried to erase my biases of the other films and judge them all together after watching them chronologically, then I'd supposedly come to the same conclusion that everyone else did, that the Marvel movies are awesome, basically the greatest films ever made in the past century, and revolutionary to the superhero genre. Unfortunately, that's not even close to what happened. I started off with the first Iron Man movie and I genuinely loved it. The acting was great, cinematography was perfect, the music was a bit on the dull side, but the narrative really made up for it. On top of that, it had a really great blend of practical effects and CGI, something of which only a couple other Marvel movies have actually been able to replicate. I had a few minor nitpicks, but nothing that really detracted from the experience, and Iron Man is to this day still my favorite Marvel movie and one of my favorite superhero movies ever. I was so impressed with it that I figured all the rest of the movies really just be way better when I actually know what the hell they're even going on about. This thought was immediately destroyed when I watched Iron Man 2, a movie that was so safe, unfun, boring, and groan-inducingly predictable that I was dumbfounded at the massive drop in quality between it and its predecessor. Iron Man was a gritty movie that wasn't afraid to tackle subjects like sex, war, torture, murder, and morality. It's the only Marvel movie to have included people that were very obviously meant to be Muslim fundamentalists as a major enemy. Iron Man wasn't edgy for the sake of appealing to the masses, it was edgy because it tackled subjects that many films in general just try to ignore. In that way, it's still to this day one of the most unique superhero films I've ever watched. Iron Man 2, however, throws all of this out the window in favor of a plot so bland that I barely even remember it. There were villains that had practically nothing to do with anything. There was like some Russian guy, I think, and he helped make robots because Iron Man didn't want to do it, and then all the robots almost kill everyone, and Iron Man stops them and blows up half a city in the process. Keep this in mind, by the way, because that's something that plays directly into Civil War. All in all, Iron Man 2 was a gigantic disappointment after what I considered to be a genuinely phenomenal film, and harkened back to the feelings I had after watching the later Marvel movies, which I felt were so painfully safe, inoffensive, and used more CGI. I thought it was kind of weird that they replaced Terrence Howard with Don Cheadle, who looks absolutely fucking nothing like him, but on the upside, I think Don Cheadle worked in that role a hell of a lot better than Terrence Howard did. did. I can't really see him flying around in an Iron Man suit, needless to say. Next, I watched The Incredible Hulk, and oh man, this is by far and away the worst film in the entire MCU. The plot is a mess, the protagonist felt extremely underdeveloped, the other characters were just flat out boring, the CGI and special effects were serviceable at best. Cinematography wasn't necessarily bad, but it was pretty bland, and there were a few shots that were just really weirdly placed. All in all, it doesn't shock me in the slightest that this never got a sequel. Then I watched Thor, and well, it was bad. My opinion had unfortunately not changed since watching it the first time. So at this point, I had watched the first 4 MCU films and only liked one of them, so I was really counting on Captain America to pull through. And I liked it. It was good. Not great, but good. Some of its effects looked really wonky and awkward, but for the most part, it was enjoyable. I liked the setting, I liked most of the characters, the music was actually really well composed, the cinematography was really good and assisted by some really neat lighting effects, the plot was predictable, but not necessarily terrible, and the acting was good. Again, not great, but good. It was a solid 7 out of 10 movie, which is more than I can say about everything between it and Iron Man 1. I can't say I was super impressed, but I can say it was at least a fun movie and I came out of it fairly pleased. And here's where I expected things to change. I had heard nothing, absolutely nothing, but unending praise for the first Avengers movie. I heard it was revolutionary to the genre, the best film in the entire MCU, a movie so unimaginably awesome that people would be forced to wonder how such a phenomenal movie could have ever been made. Despite my misgivings for the rest of the series up until that point, I was genuinely excited to watch it. And well, I honestly didn't like it at all. It wasn't a bad film, not really, but it just didn't do anything really special. The cinematography was bland and there were some really awkward shots like the one where Nick Fury gets out of his car in the beginning. I can tell what they were going for with that shot, but it just felt stiff and disjointed. There's a lot of other shots in the movie that feel very similar to that. I thought that for the most part the team had good chemistry, but their introductions to one another were pretty bland and seemed a bit rushed. And their general story arc was pretty generic at that. Some bad guy gets a weapon that'll destroy the world, heroes come together, they don't like each other at first, they get into an argument, a catastrophic event happens that tears them apart, the apocalypse happens, and they all come together against all odds to fight and win against an enemy that by all means they shouldn't be able to fight against. It's nothing you haven't seen a million times over and is identical to the plot of nearly every single MCU movie released. It feels like this movie was popularized by its premise alone and not how good of a movie it was. Sure, you can have a bunch of iconic superheroes together on one screen, but they go through all the same motions that you see in a ton of other stories that are frankly much better. Hell, Star Wars did this whole plot better 30 years prior. Ultimately, the Avengers disappointed me. I thought this was going to be the movie that signified the turning point of the series, something that would make me really love and care about this universe and its setting. Instead, it just felt like a by-the-numbers action flick whose real only selling point was its premise. A premise that wasn't even original because I remember there being a cartoon Avengers way back when. I don't remember anything about it or even if it's good, but I remember it existing. And unfortunately, the majority of the franchise feels exactly the same as this movie. Almost every single Marvel movie to come out after the Avengers feels like they went with the idea of bigger equals better. Iron Man 3 comes along and I liked it a little better than the second, but it still felt like it failed to live up to how good the first one was. Worst of all, it was boring. I got nothing out of it. I didn't feel like Tony Stark ever advanced as a character. Nothing in the MCU was drastically changed. If you totally ignored Iron Man 3, you would literally not miss anything. There was practically nothing in that movie that ever came up again later in the series. In fact, there was nothing that either Iron Man sequel did that wasn't adequately conveyed in the first film. Oh hey, Iron Man has all these new gadgets now. Cool, that's totally irrelevant and barely plays a role outside of one throwaway scene in Age of Ultron. Thor: The Dark World was just as boring and unimpressive as I remember it being. I saw Ant-Man and I don't remember if this was in the correct order or if it came after Avengers: Age of Ultron, but I saw it now and well, it wasn't all that good. I mean, it had its moments, but conceptually it was kind of a dumb idea. The protagonist was pretty much just a knockoff of Deadpool, but a hell of a lot less likable, and overall the movie just felt bland and kind of uninspired. Not necessarily a bad film, but even now, a little over a month after watching it, I barely even remember what it was about. Now, here's where things changed. Captain America Winter Soldier comes along. Given Marvel's track record, I wasn't too excited. I heard great things about this movie, but I heard great things about the Avengers as well. However, those great things said about the Winter Soldier turned out to be absolutely true. This was by far and away one of the best films in the MCU and damn near almost as good as the first Iron Man. If it just took one step further, just tried to be a tiny bit grittier, it could have been on par or better. The story was great, even though I admittedly kind of ruined it for myself by watching Civil War first. I loved the espionage and covert ops shit they were doing. The awesome plot twist made me genuinely wonder where the plot was gonna go next. It blended really well-crafted CGI and practical effects seamlessly to the point where most of the CGI looked stunningly real. The soundtrack took a step back like the rest of the franchise, but everything else excelled. It took my expectations from the first Captain America and blew them out of the water. I still hold Winter Soldier as being one of the best superhero films ever made. It's a genuine joy to watch, and it reignited the excitement I had in the series, only to be immediately crushed again with Age of Ultron. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually really liked parts of this movie. I thought the CGI got a little overzealous at times, but at the very least, the CGI was really good, and in some areas truly excellent. The soundtrack wasn't very good, but there were a few scores that stuck out to me, particularly near the end of the film. Cinematography was pretty good, special effects were great, the acting was mostly superb, though Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch felt pretty static in my opinion. It was honestly just the terrible writing of the story that made me not like this movie. Tony Stark goes from being arguably the smartest one on the team to constantly making really bad decisions that he should know, given everything he's seen and been through, and just fucking common goddamn sense are really bad ideas. The entire premise of this movie is that Tony Stark took one look at the literal weapon of a god and said to himself, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if I used the energy from it to illegally craft an artificial intelligence without anyone in the movie knowing?" Banner tries to tell him how dumb of an idea it is, but he ignores him, and then Banner, after telling him how stupid this idea is, almost immediately ignores it and goes right along with the plan as well. Now sure, you could just pass that off as saying Tony Stark is just getting arrogant, but this isn't the first time he fucks up in this movie. So with only a vague idea of what he's even doing, he makes an AI, leaves it virtually unattended, makes absolutely no failsafe or precaution to restrain it if something bad might happen, and he unintentionally creates something so bad that it literally wants to destroy the entire planet. On top of this, later on when Ultron is making a body for himself, Tony figures, hey, you know what would be a great idea? Let's do the same exact fucking thing that I just established to be a bad idea beforehand, so we can pit two immensely dangerous entities together to see how that turns out. Banner somehow agrees to this as well, despite it being the dumbest idea ever, and only by Thor having an extremely vague vision in this random pool of water in the middle of nowhere does this retarded idea somehow work in their favor. Also, I wasn't all that big of a fan of the villain. Ultron was a cool concept, I guess, but the whole evil robot thing has been done to death, and I found his little quips to be more annoying than they were funny. Aside from the generally dumb plot, I had some other issues with it from a technical angle, like the really shitty color filters, badly framed shots, and inconsistent pacing. Sure, Age of Ultron had its moments. Although I think Quicksilver was woefully undeveloped, his death scene was actually pretty fitting with the general tone of the movie, and even though Scarlet Witch is about as interesting as a rock, I do think her acting at this point in the film was pretty solid. Unfortunately, Age of Ultron left on a bit of a sour note. I think I ultimately liked it more than the first Avengers, if only because it looked prettier, but the narrative was sloppy and some of the editing and camera work just looked bad. At this point, I had watched like 10 of these movies and I only liked 2 of them. Then came Guardians of the Galaxy, a movie that a lot of people like, but I really didn't. Now, from a technical angle, this was, again, a really solid movie. It was well paced, mostly well acted, the CGI was a bit overused, but it was mostly good, or at the very least it was passable. The soundtrack isn't anything I go out and buy, but it fit well with the film, the cinematography was good, at least 70 to 80% of the jokes landed and were genuinely funny, and it was at least entertaining. But the story is where it falls apart. This is one of the blandest plots I have ever seen. The villain couldn't possibly be more faceless and uninteresting. I don't even remember his fucking name. He's evil because he's evil. He wants to do what every bad guy wants to do and blow up a planet. His servant is a Boba Fett wannabe, which is already bad in itself because Boba Fett is a stupid fucking character that never did a single thing of value anyway. And just like with the Avengers, I really feel like the only reason people like this movie was just because of its concept. Take a bunch of no-name comic book characters and make a movie out of them. Wow, holy shit, something new? Fucking crazy. Unfortunately, its plot is so predictable that it's impossible to really care about it. The villains aren't interesting, the fighting scenes still feel really dull, and it just feels like some really overrated origin story that could have been done much better. I can see why people enjoy it, but I don't see how it's held in such high regard when it doesn't really excel at anything. Then comes Civil War. I figured, hey, maybe now that I know what's gonna happen, and given that I loved Winter Soldier, maybe I'll like this one now. But I didn't. And despite people adoring this film, I don't see it as being too much better than Age of Ultron. Throwing in Spider-Man wasn't particularly cool. It was just a cameo whose entire purpose was to say, hey, we're making a Spider-Man movie now. The colors looked really washed out and dull. There was way too many unnecessary characters in a general story that didn't need this many characters. Fucking Ant-Man shows up in like the last 45 minutes, and it wasn't even until he put on his suit that I even realized who the hell he was. I fucking saw Ant-Man, and I genuinely had no idea it was Ant-Man until he started doing things. Spider-Man's involvement in this movie really didn't amount to anything more than Marvel teasing you for an upcoming Spider-Man movie that would supposedly not be as mind-numbingly awful as the Andrew Garfield movies. When it comes to Black Panther, it takes like half of the fucking movie to even establish that he's Black Panther. And for me, being someone who hasn't read the comics, I had no fucking idea who he was or why the movie was putting such a bizarre emphasis on this random black guy. Now sure, there has to be some respect for the source material, and if this is true to the character arc in the comics, then that's one thing, but a movie adaptation should be able to adequately convey that idea to an audience without having to rely on the source material. This is one of the 100,000 reasons why I hated The Dark Tower. I fucking read all of those books, and nothing in the film is ever explained in even the simplest fucking way for an audience that hasn't read the books. And that's setting aside the fact that it butchered all of the books in the first place. Civil War puts this crazy emphasis on what we assume to be some random guy, and then out of nowhere he's Black Panther, and I guess we're expected to react to that in some positive way or something. But part of what made Civil War so impossible for me to enjoy is its arrogant use of incorporating various major plot points from other movies and making them incredibly important to the central plot of this one. You can't just watch the Captain America movies, you need to see like everything for Civil War to make sense, which is weird because the other Marvel movies up to this point just had a few innocuous little nods to other films to remind you that they're all in the same universe. You know, like the couple of moments in Thor Dark World where they had like a couple little references to the Avengers, but you didn't really need to understand them to understand the story of that one. This one, however, throws practically all of the Avengers at you and basically acts as a sorry for Age of Ultron sucking, here's a slightly better one that really isn't all that better at all. Not to mention, the plot was kind of dumb. Like, it builds up this idea that you're supposed to care about the conflict between Iron Man and Captain America based on an incredibly flimsy plot point from a different movie. Essentially, at the beginning of this film, the Avengers accidentally kill some people, which is controversial because something that was almost entirely out of their control happened that affected them. Later, Tony Stark meets some random bitch in a hallway that says Ultron killed her son. So despite Tony Stark personally causing a lot of damage and presumed deaths in his own 3 films and in both Avenger movies, something that he should have known about already, just some random chick coming up to him is enough for him to say that the Avengers should have some restraint. Remember when you tried doing that the last time, Tony? You know, the time when you created an AI that killed a bunch of people? On top of that, Tony has some weird vendetta against trying to figure out what Bucky's doing and how he even fits into the story, which eventually draws back to Bucky killing his parents, a thing he did that was virtually entirely out of his control, and also a thing that was so small and irrelevant that when it came up again, even after seeing Civil War once before, I forgot all about it. This leads to an entirely unnecessary fight scene that probably could have been avoided if anyone took 2 seconds to explain what happened to Bucky. Presumably, Captain America knows at least some of what's been going on with him, and Bucky himself knows what's been going on with Bucky, so 2 members of the party of 3 should have been able to provide him with an adequate and sensible explanation for why Iron Man's parents are dead. But this just goes back to what I said earlier. Everything is required now. You now have to watch the fucking Iron Man movies to understand Captain America. Civil War feels like some TV episode rather than an actual movie. You could watch the Iron Man and Thor movies without watching the others. You could watch the first 2 Captain America movies without watching the others. Now it just feels like they've gotten lazy with their writing, and it's just assumed that you already know everything from the like 10 or 11 other movies up to this point that aren't even totally related to the main plot of Civil War, that plot being the mystery behind what happened to Bucky and tying up the loose ends left after the last 2 Captain America films. This whole movie feels like a jumbled mess of different plot points to set up different movies. It's almost like they didn't have an idea of what to do with the 3rd movie and just decided to make another Avengers instead. Sure, the cinematography was fine, acting was good, special effects and CGI were okay, music was forgettable, but at this point, there is yet to be a single truly good Marvel movie soundtrack outside of a handful of Guardians of the Galaxy tracks. The editing is good, but the plot is where it lost me. Civil War's story barely even counts as a story. It feels like it meanders into 50 different subplots, of which most aren't even resolved. I guess it just assumes you're gonna watch the other movies anyway, so why even bother making a single solid film? Let's just put in all of the characters, and we want to remind you of the existence of Ant-Man, set up films for Spider-Man and Black Panther, and set up the beginning of the next Avengers movie. That's literally all Civil War is. It's set up for 4 different movies. The Bucky storyline is reduced to an afterthought, taking backseat to this crazy emphasis on all these other storylines that Marvel feels is necessary to establish before making the next 4 films. A film should be its own self-contained thing. Sure, you can have plot points that play into the next Avengers movie when things are supposedly going to pop up again, but Civil War feels like the second act of a story. There's no beginning, middle, and end. It's just the middle point to something that's presumably better. There was certainly entertainment value to be had. I think the action, while not very well shot and kind of dull, was at least entertaining to watch. It was captivating enough for me to be entertained, but the plot, or rather lack thereof, is where it fell apart for me. The spiderweb of disjointed plot points designed pretty much solely for the purpose of making sequels and not actually adding anything meaningful to the central story is just more of a headache than something that I can be entertained by. So then I see Doctor Strange, and this one I really liked. It had some of the campy, safe, inoffensive flaws of the previous Marvel movies, but I thought its humor was solid, not laugh-out-loud funny, but amusing enough to be acceptable. Special effects and CGI were absolutely phenomenal, easily some of the best in the MCU. The attention to detail, the mythos, the acting, all of it was great. Even the story was really interesting. Stephen Strange goes through an actual character arc. He's not the same person at the end as he was in the beginning. The villains were pretty generic, and the whole Dormammu guy was kind of lame, but what this movie did well, it did really well, and I liked it for that. Next was Guardians of the Galaxy 2, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, but then again, so is this whole video, but I actually liked this movie more than the first one. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have its flaws, because it sure as shit does, but it succeeds in areas its predecessor didn't. I felt the CGI was way overused this time around, but I appreciated its stylistic look. I think it could have done better with less of it, but it was stylized to a point that I was at least more accepting of it than I was with, say, Thor Ragnarok. Even the sets and practical effects were made with the intention of fitting as seamlessly as possible with the rest of the world, and for the most part, I think it did work. The soundtrack was good, the acting was, well, pretty much the same as the first, and unlike the first, this one actually had a decent plot. Nothing that'll blow your mind by any means, but there were some surprisingly well done emotional cues. The Boba Fett character actually seemed to have a fleshed out story this time around. The main villain had a personality and motivations and was at least moderately likable. And some of the jokes, like the Mary Poppins one, were actually really funny. Unfortunately, its biggest fault was its comedy. It felt like it was trying too hard to be edgy with crude sexual humor that got so overused that it made me groan every time it came up. When Drax literally asks a character if he has a dick, I couldn't be fucked to care less about the comedy anymore. Speaking of which, Drax apparently went through the SpongeBob syndrome of being way too overly mean-spirited. I know that must sound rich coming from me, but but there is a level of mean-spiritedness that is acceptable in a comedy. When you have a character whose entire purpose is to shit all over another character for almost the entire film, despite that other character having done nothing to deserve that mean-spiritedness, it just starts to feel unwarranted and kinda shitty. This is pretty serious given that the first movie was actually pretty genuinely funny, but this movie, another that was meant to be a comedy, really isn't funny outside of like 2 or 3 moments throughout the whole film. Again, I don't think this is a bad film. I actually did enjoy this. Maybe not as much as the first Iron Man, Winter Soldier, and Doctor Strange, but I did have fun watching it. As to Thor Ragnarok, I wasn't a fan, as many of you already know. It had the most egregious use of using CGI way too fucking much. It tried to be funny like Guardians of the Galaxy, and not a single joke landed. The action felt dull and uninspired. There were characters that had no reason to even be there. The tone was all over the place. Some of the acting was just phoned in. The special effects were incredibly lackluster, particularly when Thor gets his eye comically stabbed out, and I walked out thinking it was only the best Thor movie, but still not a good movie in general. And as a side note, I do want to address this thing I saw in the comments a lot on my Thor video, which is that I'm totally against CGI and my expectations are unrealistic. First off, I'm not that against CGI at all. In some cases, I think CGI looks pretty good. The Lord of the Rings trilogy has CGI that's not only great, but in many cases is a hell of a lot better than most of the CGI you see in movies today. The difference is that Lord of the Rings blended CGI and practical effects and actually used this amazing concept called effort. Effort is how you get gorgeous movies like Blade Runner 2049, a movie that looks objectively better than literally every single Marvel movie out there. This including the ones that I liked. You also couldn't possibly recreate the entire world with practical effects. Except for the 100,000 instances where they do. Sure, big sweeping establishing shots for sci-fi city landscapes are CGI, but the actual areas that characters are interacting with are, for the most part, practical. Thor Ragnarok, on the other hand, has so few practical effects that I can literally count them on one hand. And this asinine idea that you couldn't possibly recreate the junk world or whatever the fuck it's called is also stupid. Sure, you can't recreate literally the entire damn thing, but you can recreate enough for the characters to interact with it that it should look good. If Blade Runner 2049 has a budget that's barely higher than Thor Ragnarok, then I'm sorry, but I don't give a shit how many excuses you try to make. The movie loses points in my eyes if it looks staggeringly dated compared to a movie whose budget was only a few $1,000,000 more than a film that's part of one of the biggest film franchises of all time. Also, as another side note, I know that comedy is subjective. What I find funny, someone else won't find funny. What they find funny, I won't find funny. That's just true for all comedy across the board, but like the Thor Ragnarok comedy was Transformers level of bad. I mean, I genuinely thought Guardians of the Galaxy 1 was funny, and I find that at least 70 to 80% of the jokes throughout all Marvel movies outside of Thor Ragnarok hit and were pretty well done and I found funny. Maybe not laugh out loud funny, but at least it got a chuckle out of me. Thor Ragnarok was just so unfunny that I didn't laugh or chuckle or smile at anything, except for the parts that it didn't mean to be laughed, chuckled, or smiled at. And that's what brings us to here. Again, I still haven't watched Spider-Man Homecoming, and maybe that's the greatest fucking movie ever made, but based on everything else I've seen, I doubt it. The MCU is this big, grandiose idea that's awesome in concept, but beyond that, it doesn't really do much to impress me. Most of the movies have become really cheesy and safe, never going out of their way to try and impress you. I think that's one of my biggest gripes with these films. Very few of these movies are legitimately bad. Most of them fall around good, or in the case of Iron Man, Winter Soldier, and Doctor Strange, phenomenal. Even the Thor movies, which I don't find to be good on any level, aren't anywhere close to the level of awfulness you see in the DCEU, for example. But I went into these films with an open mind and honest excitement. I was starting to get into superhero films after watching The Dark Knight and the X-Men films that weren't terrible, and I genuinely wanted to give this series a chance. But time and time again, it just failed to impress me. There is not one single thing that any of these movies, including the ones that I like, have done that haven't been done before and done better. The MCU is basically the movie industry's version of Destiny. It's largely popular based on concept and the fact that it was the first to start doing what it does, not necessarily because it's good at it. And what really amuses me is how rabid the fan base is. As soon as I said anything negative about Thor Ragnarok, I had people leaving comments like, "You're just doing this for attention, you just hate good movies, you hate everything because you're jaded and dead inside," and my personal favorite, "You're the kind of person that hates good things and you'll just end up committing a mass murder and killing yourself afterward." Yep, you heard that right. That was an actual fucking comment I received on that video. People get so insanely defensive over anything negative said about Marvel movies that it makes some ultra-religious fundamentalists look sane by comparison. It's like any dissenting opinion of their favorite movies is like the equivalent of some deeply personal attack on themselves. And look, in some cases like with the DCEU, I genuinely cannot tell how people like those movies. But in the case of the Marvel films, I can at the very least tell why people find it entertaining. What I can't tell is why they like them as much as they do. The Marvel films are held to this ridiculously high standard, as if movies like Inception, The Lord of the Rings, Interstellar, Edge of Tomorrow, Oblivion, The Revenant, or even other superhero films like The Dark Knight or Logan haven't utterly demolished that standard 1,000 times over. There's nothing about most Marvel movies that really raises the bar. Everything is painfully safe. I remember hearing news stories before it came out about how Guardians of the Galaxy 2 was a risky and ambitious movie. But what was really risky or ambitious about it? Giving it a halfway original plot? And when I lay out all of my criticisms movie by movie and ask people why they like them so much, the best answer I can get is, it's fun. Which is fine, by all means. If you can get enjoyment out of it, then more power to you, but I can think of 100 movies that are fun and also infinitely better than any given Marvel movie, including the few that I liked. Marvel is just this haven for films that do not excel in anything. They never try to push the bar forward, never try to tackle difficult themes, and instead rely on spectacle to trick you into thinking you're watching some revolutionary movie. What I found is the best superhero movies are the ones that don't feel like superhero movies, and the worst superhero movies are the ones that focus so much on the superhero aspect that they forget to be a good movie first. Films like The Dark Knight and Logan are great because they take already established characters and put them in a setting that's moderately realistic in the context of their worlds. They focus on telling a good story first and being a superhero story second. Logan is an excellent film, not because it's a superhero movie, but because it hits all the right notes for what makes a great movie in general. Logan has a profound character arc. The story itself has a definitive beginning, middle, and end. The editing is fantastic. The blend of CGI and practical effects was nothing short of perfect. The music wasn't too special, but it had a few memorable tracks and fit well with the general tone of the film. The acting was nothing short of excellent, and the effects and CGI were all top-notch. But here's the thing that makes Logan such a superior movie to the majority of the MCU. Where many of the Marvel films like Ant-Man, Thor, Captain America, and so on go for a more campy, stylized comic book feel, Logan took bits and pieces of the original source material from the comics and incorporated them in its own self-contained story with its own themes, its own characters, and its own world. Sure, Wolverine and Professor X are still running around, but if someone showed that movie to you without the knowledge that it was even an X-Men film, you'd never guess it was part of the X-Men universe. When I first saw the trailer of that movie, I didn't realize it was an X-Men film until the very end when it showed him take out the Wolverine claws. Same goes for The Dark Knight, Deadpool, Iron Man, Winter Soldier, and Doctor Strange. All of these movies are great because they don't focus so heavily on the superhero aspects. Logan's claws and regenerating abilities are more just a staple of his character rather than an actual plot device. Captain America is great in the first two movies because he's just a guy that can fight really good. Sure, he becomes an icon of hope and courage as he steadily transforms throughout the course of his story arc, but what makes him fun is the fact that he's vulnerable, he's imperfect, he's a believable and relatable character. Sure, he's the protagonist and we know given the source material he's meant to be a badass, but the films are written to make sure that's not the emphasis of the story. You know how a lot of strong female characters are built on the basis that they're just supposed to be a strong female character? A lot of these superhero movies are built on the basis that the characters are just supposed to be superheroes. Very few of them are built on the basis of what made them a superhero to begin with. I can give props to Marvel for making an honest attempt to make most of their superheroes go through a steady character arc, but it seems like with every sequel, they've forgotten what makes these characters good to begin with. Captain America isn't the compelling character in Civil War that he was in the first two movies. Iron Man isn't the compelling character we saw in the first movie. I fear for Doctor Strange because he could very well fall prey to the same exact trap that every Marvel character has fallen into at this point. It seems that everyone is just a blank slate. We're expected to care about them because of our past experiences in their previous better movies, despite them now being reduced to dumb action props that sometimes throw out a line of boring dialogue. If you were to be introduced to Captain America in the third movie, then then you'd never glean even a hint of his personality. When it comes to Thor, all three of these movies are so wildly inconsistent in tone and narrative that I genuinely don't even know what his personality is supposed to be at this point. When all of these iconic heroes clash in Civil War, it doesn't have any of the weighty impact that I'm sure it was supposed to have. We're talking about a group of heroes that we're supposed to care about at this point, who we've had multiple movies to get to know, and now they're all fighting each other. This should have been a supremely emotional moment. When Iron Man fought Bucky and Captain America, this should have been one of the most emotional moments in the entire franchise, but instead it just comes down to a generic action scene that lacks any of the weight it should have had. None of the action scenes in most Marvel films have any urgency. They rarely ever feel like there's something legitimately at stake. It becomes comical when you have someone like the Hulk throwing people around and beating their faces in with enough force to pulverize a building, yet they walk away almost entirely unscathed. And the one time that Marvel actually decided to kill off a character, it was a poorly developed side character who was only present for like 30 minutes of screen time in the entire franchise, and on top of that, his death was stupid because earlier in the film, he showed him dodging bullets and shit, yet when it actually matters, he's just riddled with them. The only time they've actually done something harmful to any character someone gave a shit about was in Civil War when Rhodey gets hit by the Vision and becomes paralyzed. So in other words, a side character that was very easy to forget even existed for the vast majority of these films gets the brunt of it, and that's it. Marvel movies had what I'm starting to call the Walking Dead syndrome, where characters are becoming so invulnerable that no matter the situation, you know they're likely never going to have anything truly bad happen to them. The only time in the past 4 seasons of the show where anything happened to a character anyone actually gave a shit about was when Glenn died, and that's just something that happened in the comics, which the show barely followed up until that point. Only with Marvel, it actually might be worse. None of the characters have had anything profound happen to them. Even Nick Fury's death in Winter Soldier was negated halfway through the movie when he came back anyway. Sure, Thor lost his hammer in his eye, but he also attained a power so great that it kind of makes the loss of those two things really irrelevant. It rarely ever feels like anything of value is ever accomplished. Sure, it was cool seeing a good chunk of the Avengers locked up, but they're all freed within 30 minutes anyway, so what was even the fucking point of doing it? The only time, and I mean literally the only time, when any Marvel movie has actually hit me on any level was when Yondu died at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy 2, both because I didn't initially see it coming and because I felt like he had some pretty cool development in that film. But again, he was a side character that didn't really get any development until he died. The only good thing that'll likely come out of it is that it'll develop Star-Lord's character a little more, since he went from being pretty likable in the first movie to playing pretty much the exact same role he did in Jurassic World. These movies have been teasing us with the whole Infinity Stone thing for like a third of the series now, and the Infinity Stones have played approximately no role whatsoever aside from one of them being in Vision's forehead. We're expected to be scared of, or at least care about, Thanos, who's just a really big CGI purple person who has had less screen time than the fucking Stan Lee cameos, and even less development than the Stan Lee cameos. Why should I give a shit about him exactly? He's a bad guy, so I'm just automatically supposed to care? Sure, maybe the comics explain this, but the films have not given any adequate explanation for him or the Infinity Stones at all. They're things that have been vaguely mentioned, played no role whatsoever, and are easily forgotten because they're so utterly pointless, yet we're expected to care. And don't give me that shit of, oh, just read the comics, or oh, just look at the YouTube videos, because I shouldn't have to do either. It should be adequately explained in the film. I shouldn't have to go in search of external material to figure out what any of this shit is supposed to mean. And sure, not every villain is meant to be cared for. The villains in Logan played a minor role, but that was because Logan was an extremely personal story about Wolverine and Laura. We're not really supposed to care about the villains. Now, that'd be all good and fine if that were the case with Marvel movies, but I have yet to see a single Marvel film tell a personal story like Logan. Their villains commonly take the backdrop, have little to no development outside of Loki and Bucky at best, and we're supposed to care when these apocalyptic events happen because I guess we should already know the story of the comics to fill in the gaps that the movie makers are too lazy to fill in themselves. A good adaptation of any literary work should be able to adequately explain the little nuances of the story and characters. If you can't do that, then your adaptation has failed. If it's not an adaptation, at least not directly, then you should at the very least be able to adequately explain this shit within the confines of your own story and universe and not rely on comic book knowledge to suffice for actual character development. Come on, was there one person on the planet that was surprised when Ego turned out to be the bad guy? His fucking name is ego. Almost the whole movie revolved around him and his planet, and there was conveniently no other acting villain lurking around, so the only possible one in the film who could be the bad guy is the one that just randomly showed up out of nowhere claiming to be Star-Lord's dad. And then there's characters like Dormammu, some thing that played such an insignificant role that he may as well have not even been in the movie to begin with. The bad guy from Guardians of the Galaxy was the most generic, unlikable villain ever. I guess there was some generic Russian guy or something in Civil War who was pointless and forgettable. Ultron was cool in concept but had terrible execution. Every Iron Man villain has been pretty lame, even the ones from the first movie. Not only is the Thor Dark World villain some throwaway prop, but I genuinely don't even remember what the hell he was trying to do. For that matter, I barely even remember the general plot. I guess what most of this comes down to is that I don't see what's really impressive or unique about most of these films. They have insane hype trains and a massive fan base of people who practically worship these movies. That's not to say that's a bad thing, not necessarily, but I don't really see how such a consistently mediocre action franchise keeps getting the attention that it does. Like I said before, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that any of these movies do that hasn't been done before and done better. Now that's not to say I can't enjoy a film that doesn't push the bar. I liked the new It movie and I'd really only consider that to be a 7 out of 10. I wouldn't say that Iron Man, Winter Soldier, or Doctor Strange pushed the bar at all or did anything exceptional to any degree, but I think they were all really good movies. I mean, at best, Doctor Strange just ramped up the world-bending shit from Inception. The whole concept wasn't original to begin with, and all they did was just make it bigger, but all in all, I still really liked that movie. So I'm fine with the idea of a film not necessarily pushing the bar forward, and I myself like at least a few movies that I would consider to be good but not really great in some areas. But why is it that I'm not really a fan of the MCU? And if I'm not a fan, then why do I keep watching these movies? The answers are fairly simple. I'm not a fan because there are currently 17 of these movies and only 3 of them stand out as being particularly good. That leaves 14 films that consistently never go anywhere or do anything, with at least 20 new films on the immediate horizon, and honestly, Black Panther doesn't look like it's going to be anything more than just another generic action movie with another generic protagonist in another generic setting with another generic villain. If anything, this looks like one of the most boring films ever. It would be one thing if there were like a few movies in the MCU that felt dull compared to the others, just a few movies that didn't push the bar forward or try something even remotely new, but the vast, staggering majority of these movies feel exactly the same. Every single Marvel movie, without fail, goes through the exact same motions. There's almost never any risk, but there's always a reward in it for all of the main characters. I honestly don't view these films as being much better than Transformers. Even Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and Thor Ragnarok are stooping to the levels of shitty forced sexual humor that's about as funny as a Leafy is Here video. I mean, really, what truly sets these films apart from any given piece of shit Transformers movie? They all have limp narratives, are heavy on the CGI, are basically the same reoccurring storyline with every new film. They start the same and end the same, and they ultimately just come down to stupid, lowbrow action movies. Sure, I guess Marvel doesn't necessarily blow up Anthony Hopkins or have Mark Wahlberg defy the most basic law of physics, and I'll give the Marvel movies credit for not being as utterly mind-numbingly retarded as Transformers, but when you really break them down, they're not all that different from one another. And when I ask fervent Marvel fans why they like these movies so much, the response has always come down to, it's fun. As I said before, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's movies I like because they're fun, but that's only a couple of movies I like. You know, shit like Taken and Battle Los Angeles. They're dumb movies, but they're undeniably fun. The problem with Marvel movies is that the it's fun argument is almost unanimously the reason why anyone likes any of these films. They don't have any better cinematography, music, acting, special effects, CGI editing, or storytelling than 1,000 other films on the market. There's this asinine idea I saw in my Thor Ragnarok video where people think that because I don't like the MCU movies, then by that logic, that must mean I don't like any piece of cinema. First off, that's gotta be one of the dumbest things anyone has ever said to me, and I've talked to a lot of dumb people. But if anything, I have a higher appreciation for film than most people do. Because I take every single element into account, I can be blown away when I watch a movie that really pushes the bar and turns out to be a masterpiece on its own. I'm not impressed by dumb action movies with stories so predictable that you already know the beginning, middle, and end before you buy your ticket. So that's one question out of the way, but the other is, why do I keep watching these movies? Why do I keep going to the theater to see them? Well, that's another simple answer. I want to have fun too. I want to get the entertainment value that so many other people are getting out of these films. I've never gone into a Marvel movie expecting it to be bad. I had lowered expectations for Thor Ragnarok, but even then I was hopeful because some of the reviews were really good, and a lot of people I respect said it was good even though they hated the first two films like I did. I specifically try to go into any Marvel film as unbiased and open-minded as I can. Believe me, I want to like these movies. I want to get the entertainment value out of them as much as anyone else. I'm not exactly a fan of walking out of a theater and feeling like I just wasted $20 on a movie I didn't like. I want to give these movies a chance to impress me, but the fact of the matter is that they rarely ever do. I think that for the most part, the MCU films are at the very least fun. I mean, they're stupid fun, but they're at the least captivating enough to hold my attention for a couple hours. But outside of the 3 exceptions to the series, I'm time and time again forced to wonder how any of these films are held in such high regard as if they're the greatest movies ever made, when I can point to 100 movies that did everything they did a hell of a lot better, several of which are other superhero movies. I'm not what you would call a Marvel or DC fan. I'm a good movie fan. That's not to say I don't have criticisms of various films. I love the Lord of the Rings films to death, but there's a few issues I have with them. Well, more like 1 or 2. I love The Grey and The Revenant and consider them to be 2 of the most underrated films ever made, and I still have a couple issues with them. There's no such thing as a perfect movie, book, game, or anything in general. Everything is open to criticism, and yes, that includes the Marvel films, which people get super fucking butthurt about if you say literally anything even remotely negative about them. I'd say that most Marvel films are at least a solid 6 or 7 out of 10, with a few exceptions getting to be around 4 or 5, but I consider a 5 to be average. That means that most Marvel films, in my opinion, are typically above average, but none of them make any attempt to get higher than just above average. It feels like Marvel doesn't actually give that much of a shit about being the best they can be when they know they can sucker in millions of people to see what basically amounts to the exact same movie with a slightly different cast of characters over and over and over again. And while I can stand a couple okay movies in a series, when almost every film in a 17 film, almost 19 film series can only at best be described as okay, then I'm typically not gonna walk out with an especially high opinion of them. Now we have a trailer for Infinity War, which looks alright. The cinematography they showed off looks pretty good, and Thanos at least looks way better than he did the last 2 times we saw him. There were some nice shots, the CGI doesn't look amazing, but I'll reserve judgment for the full film when they're actually finished with it, though I will say that it looks like at this point it will be at least on par with Age of Ultron, which is a good thing, by the way, because I consider that movie to be pretty beautiful looking. But I don't really care because Avengers 4 was confirmed before we even had a trailer for Infinity War, and there's already confirmed 20 sequels after that, and since there's definitely going to be several movies between now and then, it's probably going to be at least 25 to 30 sequels soon to come. Knowing that there's going to be another Avengers movie makes it pretty hard to give a shit about the supposed high stakes of Infinity War. Just based off of prior knowledge, I'm pretty sure I know exactly how Infinity War is going to go down. So it's apparently split in 2 parts, right? Okay, so here's my prediction. This will go down literally exactly the same as the 7th Harry Potter movie, which is to say the plot will probably follow all of the exact same motions, and the first part will end with the death of at least one main character or one side character. I predict that if anyone's gonna die, it will likely be Iron Man, since he's only had like 1 good movie and his movie's finished up a long time ago, and on top of that, he's been here forever. Whether he'll die at the end of the first movie is up in the air, but I'm almost positive it's gonna be him that dies. The second and less likely character to die will be Captain America, who I can see going down much like Iron Man, but I'm leaning more toward Iron Man. Of the side characters, that's really just a flip of the coin, but the one I'd guess is most at risk is Hawkeye, since it's established he has a family and shit, and typically people that are established to have a family and shit die. Know who won't be touched though? The Guardians of the Galaxy, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, or the Hulk. Absolutely none of them will die because the Guardians of the Galaxy are too big of a franchise at this point, and the others are either all starting to have their own franchises, or in the case of Hulk, is apparently in talks of starting a new franchise. Ant-Man will also either be totally forgotten, play hardly any role at all, and will also not die. Also, Thanos will have a mini victory at the end of part 1 by either acquiring most, if not all, of the Infinity Stones. Everything will be ominous and try to trick you into thinking it'll be serious in part 2, and then he'll get his ass kicked at the end of part 2 in a typical overly bombastic fight scene. Then there will be some melancholy, emotional bullshit where the characters that survived, of which the vast majority of them will, where there's guaranteed to be only 1 or 2 main deaths and maybe a few deaths of side characters that no one really cares about anyway, and act like there won't be another Avengers or 20 more sequels after that. Seriously, I'm calling it now. After part 2 comes out, come back and we'll see if I was right or not. Given the fact that almost every single one of these movies has been predictable as shit since forever, I can say with complete confidence that I am at least 90% right in my predictions of how exactly this is going to go down. So to wrap up, I do want to stress that you can still enjoy these films. You have no idea how many people watched my Thor video and just pulled this idea out of their asses that because I don't like something, that means I'm saying that you can't like it. I don't know how exactly someone makes that leap in logic. I guess that would have to be a symptom of a startling lack of logic. But if you like these movies, that's fine. I have nothing against liking them. And when it comes down to it, I'd choose any Marvel movie over anything in the DCEU in a heartbeat. At least when I go into an MCU film, I know it'll be mildly entertaining, whereas Justice League made me want to jump off a cliff within the first 10 minutes. But just because Marvel films aren't as bad as something else doesn't necessarily make them good. Just because I didn't like an incredibly subpar movie I view to be disgustingly overrated for how incredibly lazy it is, doesn't mean I'm apparently some contrarian searching for clickbait views. Holy shit, I didn't agree with the masses of people. How dare I have a higher expectation for a good film? And I know someone's gonna say, oh, well, most people like the Marvel films and they all get good reviews. Yeah, well, there's also apparently somehow a fan base of Transformers, enough that we've had 10 years of those movies. So that really does not work in your favor. And when it comes to my higher expectations of films, they are not unrealistic expectations like some people have tried to say. My expectations of a good film, game, book, whatever, are based on achievements that have already been made. When almost every single Marvel movie falls around a 6 or 7 compared to even half of the films I've seen, I can't really be fucked to continue pretending like this is the greatest series to have ever been made, like so many people try to tell me it is.